M. Madness. When Lacan uses the term madness or refers to someone as being mad, he's referring to psychosis. The psychosis corresponds to what has always been called and legitimately continues to be called madness. Lacan adds that there is no reason to deny oneself the luxury of this word. Thus, far from seeing it as a derogatory term, Lacan values it for its poetic resonances and approves of its use on condition that it is used in the precise sense of psychosis. So, for example, in 1946, Lacan congratulates the French psychiatrist Henri A. for obstinately preserving the term. Master, maître. In his work during the 1950s, Lacan often refers to the dialectic of the master and the slave, which Hegel introduces in Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807. As in all his other Hegelian references, Lacan is indebted to Alexandre Kojèv's reading of Hegel, which Lacan encountered when attending Kojèv's lectures on Hegel in the 1930s. See Kojève. According to Kojève, the dialectic of the master and the slave is the inevitable result of the fact that human desire is the desire for recognition. In order to achieve recognition, the subject must impose the idea that he has of himself on an other. However, since this other also desires recognition, he also must do the same, and hence the subject is forced to engage in combat with the other. This fight for recognition, for pure prestige, Kojève, must be a fight to the death, since it is only by risking his life for the sake of recognition that one can prove that he is truly human. However, the combat must in fact stop short of the death of either combatant, since recognition can only be granted by a living being. Thus the struggle ends when one of the two gives up his desire for recognition and surrenders to the other. The vanquished one recognizes the victor as his master and becomes his slave. In fact, human society is only possible because some human beings accept being slaves instead of fighting to the death. A community of masters would be impossible. After achieving victory, the master sets the slave to work. For him, the slave works by transforming nature in order that the master may consume it and enjoy it. However, the victory is not as absolute as it seems. The relation between the master and the slave is dialectical because it leads to the negation of their respective positions. On the one hand, the recognition achieved by the master is unsatisfactory because it is not another man who grants him this recognition, but only a slave, who is for the master a mere animal or thing. Thus, the man who behaves as a master will never be satisfied. Kojève. On the other hand, the slave is partly compensated for his defeat by the fact that, by working, he raises himself above nature by making it other than it was. In the process of changing the world, the slave changes himself and becomes the author of his own destiny, unlike the master who changes only through the mediation of the slave's work. Historical progress is now the product of the working slave and not of the warlike master, Kojève. The outcome of the dialectic is therefore paradoxical. The master ends up in a dissatisfying existential impasse, while the slave retains the possibility of achieving true satisfaction by means of dialectically overcoming his slavery. Lacan draws on the dialectic of the master and the slave to illustrate a wide range of points. For example, the struggle for pure prestige illustrates the intersubjective nature of desire, in which the important thing is for desire to be recognized by an other. The fight to the death also illustrates the aggressivity inherent in the dual relationship between the ego and the counterpart. Furthermore, the slave who resignedly waits for the master's death offers a good analogy of the obsessional neurotic, who is characterized by hesitation and procrastination. Lacan also takes up the dialectic of the master and the slave in his theorization of the discourse of the master. In the formulation of this discourse, the master is the master signifier, as one who puts the slave as to work and to produce a surplus objectivity A, which he can appropriate for himself. The master signifier is that which represents a subject for all other signifiers. The discourse of the master is thus an attempt at totalization, which is why Lacan links the discourse of the master with philosophy and ontology, playing on the homophony between maître and être. However, this attempt always fails because a master signifier can never represent the subject completely. There is always some surplus which escapes representation. Materialism. By addressing the issues of psychogenesis, the mind-body problem, etc., psychoanalysis necessarily raises ontological questions. The question of whether Freud's views can be considered materialistic or not is difficult to answer. On the one hand, he insisted on the importance of the physical substratum of all mental events, in keeping with the materialist axioms of the scientists whom he had most respected during his studies, principally Hermann Helmholtz and Ernst Brücke. On the other hand, he opposed Charcot's attempts to explain all hysterical symptoms by reference to lesions in the brain, distinguished psychical reality from material reality, and constantly emphasized the role of experience rather than heredity in the etiology of nervous illness. These two trends often converge in his writings in an uneasy alliance, as in the following sentence. Analysts are at bottom incorrigible mechanists and materialists, even though they seek to avoid robbing the mind and spirit of their still unrecognized characteristics. Freud. Lacan too presents himself as a materialist. In 1936, he criticizes associationist psychology for not living up to its purported materialism, and in 1964 he argues that psychoanalysis is opposed to any form of philosophical idealism. However, as with Freud, Lacan's declarations of materialism are highly complex. Thus it is clear even in Lacan's earliest statements on the subject that he conceives of materialism in a very particular way. In 1936, for example, he argues that materialism does not imply a rejection of the categories of intentionality and meaning, and rejects the simplistic idea of matter as a naive form which has been left behind by authentic materialism. In 1946, he repeatedly criticizes the crude form of materialism which regards thought as a mere epiphenomenon. And in 1956, he distinguishes between a naturalist materialism and a Freudian materialism. It is clear, then, that Lacan does not subscribe to that kind of materialism which reduces all causation to a crude economic determinism and which regards all cultural phenomena, including language, as a mere superstructure determined by the economic infrastructure. In opposition to this, Lacan cites Stalin's famous pronouncement that language is not a superstructure, and argues that language is something material. On these grounds, he declares that the importance he attributes to language is perfectly compatible with historical materialism. Lacan's materialism is thus a materialism of the signifier. The point of view I am trying to maintain before you involves a certain materialism of the elements in question, in the sense that the signifiers are well and truly embodied, materialized. However, the materiality of the signifier does not refer to a tangible inscription, but to its indivisibility. But if we have insisted firstly on the materiality of the signifier, this materiality is singular in many ways. The first of which is that the signifier does not withstand partition. The signifier in its material dimension, the real aspect of the signifier, is the letter. It is Lacan's materialism of the signifier which leads him to give a materialist definition of the phenomenon of consciousness. Lacan's claims that his theory of the signifier is a materialist theory are disputed by Derrida, who argues that Lacan's concept of the letter betrays an implicit idealism. Mathematics, mathématique. In his attempt to theorize the category of the symbolic, Lacan adopts two basic approaches. The first approach is to describe it in terms borrowed from linguistics, using a Saussurean-inspired model of language as a system of signifiers. The second approach is to describe it in terms borrowed from mathematics. The two approaches are complementary, since both are attempts to describe formal systems with precise rules, and both demonstrate the power of the signifier. Although there is a general shift in Lacan's work from the linguistic approach which predominates in the 1950s to a mathematical approach which predominates in the 1970s, there are traces of the mathematical approach as early as the 1940s, such as Lacan's analysis of a logical puzzle in Lacan. See his 1956 claim that the laws of intersubjectivity are mathematical. The branches of mathematics which Lacan uses most are algebra and topology, although there are also incursions into set theory and number theory. Lacan's use of mathematics represents an attempt to formalize psychoanalytic theory in keeping with his view that psychoanalytic theory should aspire to the formalization proper to science. Mathematical formalization is our goal, our ideal. Mathematics serves Lacan as a paradigm of modern scientific discourse which emerged from the little letters of mathematics. However, this use of mathematics is not an attempt to produce a meta-language, since no meta-language can be spoken. The root of the difficulty is that you can only introduce symbols, mathematical or otherwise, by using everyday language, since you have, after all, to explain what you are going to do with them. Thus, Lacan's use of mathematics is not an attempt to escape from the ambiguity of language, but on the contrary, to produce a way of formalizing psychoanalysis which produces multiple effects of sense without being reducible to a univocal signification. Also, by using mathematics, Lacan attempts to prevent all attempts at imaginary intuitive understanding of psychoanalysis. Matheme, mathème. The term mathème is a neologism which Lacan derives from the word mathematics, presumably by analogy with the term mytheme, a term coined by Claude Lévi-Strauss to denote the basic constituents of mythological systems. See Lévi-Strauss. The mathemes are part of Lacanian algebra, although the term matheme is not introduced by Lacan until the early 1970s. The two formulae which are most often referred to as mathemes date from 1957. These formulae, which are both created to designate points in the graph of desire, are the matheme for the drive, as Bart in relation to capital D, and the matheme for fantasy, as Bart in relation to objet petit a. The structural parallel between the two mathemes is clear. They are both composed of two algebraic symbols conjoined by a rhomboid, the symbol in relation to, or the symbol rhomboid, which Lacan calls the poinçon, and enclosed by brackets. The rhomboid symbolizes a relation between the two symbols, which includes the relations of envelopment, development, conjunction, disjunction. Lacan argues that the mathemes are not transcendent signifiers, they are the indices of an absolute signification. They are created to allow 101 different readings, a multiplicity that is admissible as long as the spoken remains caught in their algebra. They are constructed to resist any attempt to reduce them to one univocal signification and to prevent the reader from an intuitive or imaginary understanding of psychoanalytic concepts. The mathemes are not to be understood, but to be used. In this way, they constitute a formal core of psychoanalytic theory, which may be transmitted integrally. One certainly doesn't know what they mean, but they are transmitted. Méconnaissance. The French term méconnaissance corresponds roughly to the English words misunderstanding and misrecognition. However, the French term is usually left untranslated when translating Lacan into English in order to show its close relationship with the term connaissance, knowledge. Thus, in the imaginary order, self-knowledge, connaissance, is synonymous with misunderstanding, méconnaissance, because the process by which the ego is formed in the mirror stage is at the same time the institution of alienation from the symbolic determination of being. As well as being the structure of ordinary neurotic self-knowledge, méconnaissance is also the structure of paranoid delusions, which are described in terms of a méconnaissance systématique de la réalité. This structural homology between the ordinary constitution of the ego and the paranoid delusions is what leads Lacan to describe all knowledge, connaissance, in both neurosis and psychosis as paranoid knowledge. Méconnaissance is to be distinguished from ignorance, which is one of the three passions, see affect. Whereas ignorance is a passion for the absence of knowledge, méconnaissance is an imaginary misrecognition of a symbolic knowledge, savoir, that the subject does possess somewhere. Misrecognition is not ignorance. Misrecognition represents a certain organization of affirmations and negations to which the subject is attached. Hence it cannot be conceived without correlate knowledge. There must surely be behind his misrecognition a kind of knowledge of what there is to misrecognize. Again, this applies both in the ordinary construction of the ego and in paranoia. In the former case, the ego is basically a misrecognition of the symbolic determinants of subjectivity, the discourse of the big other, the unconscious. In the latter case, paranoid delusions always imply an obscure realization of the truth. To misunderstand méconnaître implies a recognition, reconnaissance, as is evident in systematic misunderstanding, méconnaissance systématique, where it must clearly be admitted that that which is denied is in some way recognized, reconnu. Memory, mémoire. The term memory is used in two very different ways in Lacan's work. 1. In the 1950s, memory is understood as a phenomenon of the symbolic order related to the signifying chain. It is related to the concepts of remembering and recollection, and opposed to imaginary reminiscence. Lacan makes it clear that his concept of memory is not a biological or psychological one. The memory which interests psychoanalysis is quite distinct from what psychologists speak of when they display its mechanism to us in an animate being in an experiment. For psychoanalysis, memory is the symbolic history of the subject, a chain of signifiers linked up together, a signifying articulation. Something is memorable and memorized only when it is registered in the signifying chain. In this sense, the unconscious is a sort of memory, since what we teach the subject to recognize as his unconscious is his history. The phenomena associated with memory which most interest the analyst are those moments when something goes wrong with memory, when the subject cannot recall a part of his history. It is the fact that he can forget, that a signifier can be elided from the signifying chain, that makes the psychoanalytic subject distinctive. 2. In the 1960s, Lacan reserves the term memory for the biological or physiological concept of memory as an organic property. It thus no longer designates the symbolic history of the subject which is the concern of psychoanalysis, but something which lies outside psychoanalysis altogether. Metalanguage, métalangage. Metalanguage is the technical term in linguistics for any form of language which is used to describe the properties of language. Roman Jacobson includes the metalingual function in his list of the functions of language. Lacan's first reference to metalanguage comes in 1956 when he echoes Jacobson's view on the metalingual function of all language. All language implies a metalanguage. It's already a metalanguage of its own register. A few years later, in 1960, he says precisely the opposite, arguing that no metalanguage can be spoken. What Lacan appears to mean by this remark is that since every attempt to fix the meaning of language must be done in language, there can be no escape from language, no outside. This is reminiscent of Heidegger's views on the impossibility of exiting the house of language. This also appears similar to the structuralist theme of Il n'y a rien hors du texte. There is nothing outside the text. But it is not the same. Lacan does not deny that there is a beyond of language, this beyond is the real, but he does argue that this beyond is not of a kind that could finally anchor meaning. There is, in other words, no transcendental signified, no way that language could tell the truth about truth. The same point is also expressed in the phrase, there is no big other of the big other. If the big other is the guarantee of the coherence of the subject's discourse, then the falsity of this guarantee is revealed by the fact that the guarantor himself lacks such a guarantee. In a clinical context, this means that there is no meta-language of the transference, no point outside the transference from which it could be finally interpreted and liquidated. Metaphor. Metaphor is usually defined as a trope in which one thing is described by comparing it to another, but without directly asserting a comparison. A classic example is the phrase, Juliet is the sun, in which Shakespeare describes Juliet's radiant beauty by comparing her to the sun, yet does not indicate this comparison by the use of the word like. However, Lacan's use of the term owes little to this definition and much to the work of Roman Jacobson, who in a major article published in 1956 established an opposition between metaphor and metonymy. On the basis of a distinction between two kinds of aphasia, Jacobson distinguished two fundamentally opposed axes of language. The metaphorical axis, which deals with the selection of linguistic items and allows for their substitution, and the metonymic axis, which deals with the combination of linguistic items both sequentially and simultaneously. Metaphor thus corresponds to Saussure's paradigmatic relations, which hold in absentia, and metonymy to syntagmatic relationships, which hold in presentia. Jacobson in 1956. Lacan, like many other French intellectuals of the time, such as Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roland Barthes, was quick to take up Jacobson's reinterpretation of metaphor and metonymy. In the very same year that Jacobson's seminal article was published, Lacan refers to it in his seminar and begins to incorporate the opposition into his linguistic rereading of Freud. A year later, he dedicates a whole paper to a more detailed analysis of the opposition. Following Jacobson's identification of metaphor with a substitutive axis of language, Lacan defines metaphor as the substitution of one signifier for another and provides the first formula of metaphor. This formula is to be read as follows. On the left-hand side of the equation, outside the brackets, Lacan writes f, or function, capital S, the signifying function, which is to say the effect of signification. Inside the brackets, he writes as accent bar, capital S, which means the substitution of one signifier for another. On the right-hand side of the equation, there is capital S, the signifier, and small s, the signified. Between these two symbols, there is the symbol between brackets plus, which represents the crossing of the bar between brackets minus of the Saussurean algorithm, and which represents the emergence of signification. The equal with another stripe above it sign is to be read is congruent with. Thus the whole formula reads the signifying function of the substitution of one signifier for another is congruent with the crossing of the bar. Again, thus the whole formula reads the signifying function of the substitution of one signifier for another is congruent with the crossing of the bar. The idea behind this rather obscure formulation is that there is an inherent resistance to signification in language, a resistance which is symbolized by the bar in the Saussurean algorithm. Meaning does not simply appear spontaneously, but is the product of a specific operation which crosses over the bar. The formula is meant to illustrate Lacan's thesis that this operation by the production of meaning, which Lacan calls signification, is only made possible by metaphor. Metaphor is thus the passage of the signifier into the signified, the creation of a new signified. Lacan presents another formula for metaphor in a paper written a few months later. Lacan's own explanation of this second formula is as follows. The capital S and the small s are signifiers, the small x the unknown signification, and the small s the signified induced by the metaphor, which consists in substitution in the signifying chain of capital S for capital S accent. The elision of capital S accent, represented here by the bar through it, is the condition of the success of the metaphor. Lacan puts his concept of metaphor to use in a variety of contexts. The Oedipus complex. Lacan analyzes the Oedipus complex in terms of a metaphor because it involves the crucial concept of substitution. In this case, the substitution of the name of the father for the desire of the mother. This fundamental metaphor, which founds the possibility of all other metaphors, is designated by Lacan as the paternal metaphor. Repression and neurotic symptoms. Lacan argues that repression, secondary repression, has the structure of a metaphor. The metonymic object, the signifier which is elided, capital S accent in the previous formula, is repressed, but returns in the surplus meaning, between brackets plus, produced in the metaphor. The return of the repressed, the symptom, therefore also has the structure of a metaphor. Indeed, Lacan asserts that the symptom is a metaphor. Condensation. Lacan also follows Jacobson in linking the metaphor-metonymy distinction to the fundamental mechanisms of the dream work described by Freud. However, he differs from Jacobson over the precise nature of this parallel, whereas for Jacobson, metonymy is linked to both displacement and condensation, and metaphor to identification and symbolism. Lacan links metaphor to condensation and metonymy to displacement. See Jacobson. Lacan then argues that just as displacement is logically prior to condensation, so metonymy is the condition for metaphor. The anal drive. In his paper on transformations of instinct as exemplified in anal eroticism, Freud shows how anal eroticism is closely connected with the possibility of substitution. For example, the substitution of feces for money. Lacan takes this as grounds for linking anal eroticism to metaphor. The anal level is the locus of metaphor, one object for another. Give the feces in place of the phallus. Identification. Metaphor is also the structure of identification, since the latter consists in substituting oneself for another. Love. Love is structured like a metaphor since it involves the operation of substitution. It is insofar as the function of the erastes of the lover, who is the subject of lack, comes in the place of, substitutes himself for, the function of the eromenos, the loved object, that the signification of love is produced. Metonymy. Metonymy is usually defined as a trope in which a term is used to denote an object which it does not literally refer to, but with which it is closely linked. This link may be one of physical contiguity, such as when 30 sails means 30 boats, but not necessarily, such as when I haven't read Shakespeare means I haven't read anything written by Shakespeare. However, Lacan's use of the term owes little to this definition, apart from the notion of contiguity, since it is inspired by the work of Roman Jacobson, who established an opposition between metonymy and metaphor. Following Jacobson, Lacan links metonymy to the combinatorial axis of language as opposed to the substitutive axis. For example, in the sentence I am happy, the relation between the words I and am is a metonymic relation, whereas the possibility of substituting sad for happy depends on the metaphoric relation between these two terms. In his most detailed work on the subject, Lacan defines metonymy as the diachronic relation between one signifier and another in the signifying chain. Metonymy thus concerns the ways in which signifiers can be combined, linked in a single signifying chain, horizontal relations, whereas metaphor concerns the way in which a signifier in one signifying chain may be substituted for a signifier in another chain, vertical relations. Together, metaphor and metonymy constitute the way in which signification is produced. Lacan provides a formula for metonymy. Function between brackets capital S dot 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 capital S accent close brackets capital S incongruity with capital S between brackets minus small s. This formula is to be read as follows. On the left-hand side of the equation, outside the brackets, Lacan writes function capital S, the signifying function, which is to say the effect of signification. Inside the brackets, he writes S dot 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 as accent, the link between one signifier and another in a signifying chain. On the right-hand side of the equation, there is S, the signifier, small s, the signified, and between brackets minus the bar of the Saussurean algorithm. The sign equals with is to be read is congruent with. Thus the whole formula reads: the signifying function of the connection of the signifier with the signifier is congruent with maintenance of the bar. The formula is meant to illustrate Lacan's thesis that in metonymy the resistance of signification is maintained, the bar is not crossed, so no new signified is produced. Lacan puts his concept of metonymy to use in a variety of contexts. Desire. Lacan presents metonymy as a diachronic movement from one signifier to another along the signifying chain, as one signifier constantly refers to another in a perpetual deferral of meaning. Desire is also characterized by exactly the same never-ending process of continual deferral, since desire is always desire for something else. As soon as the object of desire is attained, it is no longer desirable, and the subject's desire fixes on another object. Thus Lacan writes that desire is a metonymy. Displacement. Lacan also follows Jacobson in linking the metaphor-metonymy distinction to the mechanisms of the dream work described by Freud. However, he differs from Jacobson over the precise nature of this link, see metaphor. Just as displacement is logically prior to condensation, so metonymy is a condition for metaphor because the coordination of signifiers has to be possible before transferences of the signified are able to take place. Mirror stage. Stade du miroir. The mirror stage, also translated in English as the looking glass phase, was the subject of Lacan's first official contribution to psychoanalytic theory, when he propounded the concept of the 14th International Psychoanalytic Congress at Marienbad in 1936. The original 1936 paper was never published, but the rewritten version appeared in 1949. From this point on, the mirror stage forms a constant point of reference throughout Lacan's entire work. While apparently quite simple, the concept of the mirror stage takes on an ever-increasing complexity during the course of Lacan's work, as he takes it up and reworks it in various different contexts. The mirror test was first described by the French psychologist and friend of Lacan, Henri Wallon, in 1931, although Lacan attributes its discovery to Baldwin. It refers to a particular experiment which can differentiate a human infant from his closest animal relative, the chimpanzee. The 6-month-old child differs from the chimpanzee of the same age in that the former becomes fascinated with its reflection in the mirror and jubilantly assumes it as its own image, whereas the chimpanzee quickly realizes that the image is illusory and loses interest in it. Lacan's concept of the mirror stage, as opposed to Wallon's mirror test, is far more than a mere experiment. The mirror stage represents a fundamental aspect of the structure of subjectivity, whereas in 1936-1949 Lacan seems to see it is a stage which can be located at a specific time in the development of the child, with a beginning 6 months and an end 18 months. By the end of this period, there are already signs that he is broadening the concept. By the early 1950s, Lacan no longer regards it simply as a moment in the life of the infant, but sees it as also representing a permanent structure of subjectivity, the paradigm of the imaginary order. It is a state in which the subject is permanently caught and captivated by his own image. The mirror stage is a phenomenon to which I assign a twofold value. In the first place, it has historical value as it marks a decisive turning point in the mental development of the child. In the second place, it typifies an essential libidinal relationship with the body image. As Lacan further develops the concept of the mirror stage, the stress falls less on its historical value and ever more on its structural value. Thus by 1956, Lacan can say, the mirror stage is far from a mere phenomenon which occurs in the development of the child. It illustrates the conflictual nature of the dual relationship. The mirror stage describes the formation of the ego via the process of identification. The ego is the result of identifying with one's own specular image. The key to this phenomenon lies in the prematurity of the human baby. At 6 months, the baby still lacks coordination, however, its visual system is relatively advanced, which means that it can recognize itself in the mirror before attaining control over its bodily movements. The baby sees its own image as whole, see Gestalt, and the synthesis of this image produces a sense of contrast with the uncoordination of the body, which is experienced as a fragmented body. This contrast is first felt by the infant as a rivalry with its own image because the wholeness of the image threatens the subject with fragmentation, and the mirror stage thereby gives rise to an aggressive tension between the subject and the image. See aggressivity. In order to resolve this aggressive tension, the subject identifies with the image. This primary identification with the counterpart is what forms the ego. The moment of identification, when the subject assumes its image as its own, is described by Lacan as a moment of jubilation. Since it leads to an imaginary sense of mastery, the child's joy is due to his imaginary triumph in anticipating a degree of muscular coordination which he has not yet actually achieved. However, this jubilation may also be accompanied by a depressive reaction when the child compares his own precarious sense of mastery with the omnipotence of the mother. This identification also involves the ideal ego, which functions as a promise of future wholeness which sustains the ego in anticipation. The mirror stage shows that the ego is the product of misunderstanding, méconnaissance, and a site where the subject becomes alienated from himself. It represents the introduction of the subject into the imaginary order. However, the mirror stage also has an important symbolic dimension. The symbolic order is present in the figure of the adult who is carrying or supporting the infant. The moment after the subject has jubilantly assumed his image as his own, he turns his head round towards this adult, who represents the big other, as if to call on him to ratify this image. The mirror stage is also closely related to narcissism, as the story of Narcissus clearly shows. In the Greek myth, Narcissus falls in love with his own reflection. Möbius strip, Bande de Möbius. The Möbius strip is one of the figures studied by Lacan in his use of topology. It is a three-dimensional figure that can be formed by taking a long rectangle of paper and twisting it once before joining its ends together. The result is a figure which subverts our normal Euclidean way of representing space, for it seems to have two sides but in fact has only one and only one edge. Locally, at any one point, two sides can be clearly distinguished, but when the whole strip is traversed, it becomes clear that they are in fact continuous. The two sides are only distinguished by the dimension of time, the time it takes to traverse the whole strip. The figure illustrates the way that psychoanalysis problematizes various binary oppositions such as inside-outside, love-hate, signifier-signified, truth-appearance. While the two terms in such oppositions are often presented as radically distinct, Lacan prefers to understand these oppositions in terms of the topology of the Möbius strip. The opposed terms are thus seen to be not discrete but continuous with each other. Likewise, the discourse of the master is continuous with the discourse of the analyst. The Möbius strip also helps one to understand how it is possible to traverse the fantasy. It is only because the two sides are continuous that it is possible to cross over from inside to outside. Yet when one passes the finger round the surface of the Möbius strip, it is impossible to say at which precise point one has crossed over from inside to outside, or vice versa. Mère, in Freud's account of the Oedipus complex, the mother is the first love object of the child. It is only the intervention of the father, via the threat of castration, which forces the child to give up his desire for the mother. In the work of Melanie Klein, the emphasis shifted from the role of the father to the pregenital mother-child relation. The latter was described as a sadistic relation in which the child makes, in fantasy, vicious attacks on the mother's body and then fears retaliation from her. Mother. In his pre-war writings, Lacan alludes several times to Melanie Klein's work and describes the cannibalistic fantasies of devouring and being devoured by the mother. Lacan argues that the first of the family complexes is the weaning complex, in which the interruption of the symbiotic relation with the mother leaves a permanent trace in the child's psyche. He also describes the death drive as a nostalgic yearning to return to this relation of fusion with the mother's breast. This view of the mother as an engulfing force which threatens to devour the child is a constant theme in Lacan's work thereafter. Lacan argues that the child must detach himself from the imaginary relation with the mother in order to enter the social world. Failure to do so can result in any one of various peculiarities ranging from phobia to perversion. Since the agent who helps the child to overcome the primary attachment to the mother is the father, these peculiarities may also be said to result from a failure of the paternal function. Hence, much of Lacan's work is aimed at shifting the emphasis in analytic theory from the mother-child relation, the pre-Oedipal, the prototype of the imaginary, back onto the role of the father, the Oedipus complex, the prototype of the symbolic. The desire of the mother. According to Freud, a woman's desire to have a child is rooted in her envy of the man's penis. When the girl first realizes that she does not possess a penis, she feels deprived of something valuable and seeks to compensate for this by obtaining a child as a symbolic substitute for the penis she has been denied. Lacan follows Freud, arguing that the child always represents for the mother a substitute for the symbolic phallus which she lacks. See privation. However, Lacan emphasizes that this substitute never really satisfies the mother. Her desire for the phallus persists even after she has had a child. The child soon realizes that he does not completely satisfy the mother's desire, that her desire aims at something beyond him, and thus attempts to decipher this enigmatic desire. He must work out an answer to the question, "Que voi? What do you want from me?" The answer the child comes up with is that what the mother desires is the imaginary phallus. The child then seeks to satisfy the mother's desire by identifying with the imaginary phallus, or by identifying with the phallic mother, the mother imagined as possessing the phallus. In this game of to be or not to be the phallus, the child is completely at the mercy of the capricious desire of the mother, helpless in the face of her omnipotence. However, this sense of powerlessness may not give rise to much anxiety at first. For a time, the child experiences his attempts at being the phallus as a relatively satisfying game of seduction. It is only when the child's sexual drives begin to stir, for example in infantile masturbation, and an element of the real is thus introduced into the imaginary game, that the omnipotence of the mother begins to provoke greater anxiety in the child. This anxiety is manifested in images of being devoured by the mother and is only resolved by the intervention of the real father, who castrates the child in the third time of the Oedipus complex. The mother, real, symbolic, and imaginary. Lacan argues that it is important to distinguish between the real mother, the symbolic mother, and the imaginary mother. The mother manifests herself in the real as the primary caretaker of the infant. The infant is incapable of satisfying its own needs and so depends absolutely on a big other to care for him. See, helplessness. The mother is first of all symbolic, she only becomes real by frustrating the subject's demand. See, frustration. When the mother ministers to the infant, bringing him the objects that will satisfy his needs, these objects soon take on a symbolic function that completely eclipses their real function. The objects are seen as gifts, symbolic tokens of the mother's love. Finally, it is the mother's presence which testifies to this love, even if she does not bring any real object with her. Consequently, the mother's absence is experienced as a traumatic rejection, as loss of her love. Freud showed how the child attempts to cope with this loss. Lacan regards this primary symbolization as the child's first steps into the symbolic order. The mother which interests psychoanalytic theory is thus above all the symbolic mother, the mother in her role as the primordial big other. It is she who introduces the child into language by interpreting the child's screams and thereby retroactively determining their meaning. See punctuation. The mother is manifested in the imaginary order in a number of images. One important image that has already been mentioned is that of the devouring mother, which is at the root of anxiety. Another important maternal image is that of the phallic mother, the mother imagined as possessing the imaginary phallus.